On December 29, 1989, the Nikkei 225 stock index closed at 38,915, its all-time peak. Japanese real estate had reached valuation so extreme that the grounds of the Imperial Palace were estimated to be worth more than the entire state of California. Both would fall, and keep falling. The bubble had been building for a decade. American pressure to reduce Japan's trade surpluses led to the Plaza Accord of 1985, which deliberately appreciated the yen. To offset the resulting economic slowdown, the Bank of Japan cut interest rates sharply. Cheap money created an asset boom. Banks lent aggressively against rising real estate collateral. Corporations borrowed to buy other corporations. Individuals borrowed to buy shares. The Nikkei tripled between 1985 and 1989. Land prices in the 6 largest Japanese cities rose 90% in 4 years. The Bank of Japan raised rates 5 times between 1989 and 1990. It worked too effectively. Asset prices, which had only risen because of cheap money, fell when money became expensive. Stock prices collapsed first. Real estate, more illiquid, fell more slowly and further. By 1992, Japan's banking system was technically insolvent. Banks had lent against collateral, primarily land, now worth a fraction of the outstanding loans. But Japanese banks did not declare the losses. Cultural and regulatory pressures led them to simply not recognize bad debts. These became zombie loans, loans not being serviced but not written off, extended repeatedly so both the bank and the borrower could pretend solvency. The banks kept lending to companies that could not repay, preventing failures and preventing the losses from appearing on the ledger. Japan had entered a debt deflation spiral. Falling asset prices reduced collateral values. Banks restricted new lending. Businesses reduced investment. Reduced investment reduced incomes. Reduced incomes reduced spending. Reduced spending reduced asset prices further. The spiral had no natural flaw. The core problem was a paradox of thrift at institutional scale. Every rational actor, households, businesses, banks, responded to the collapse by reducing debt. But when everyone reduces debt simultaneously, nobody spends. When nobody spends, incomes fall. When incomes fall, repaying debt becomes even harder. Collective rationality produced collective ruin. The banking system was the transmission mechanism that failed. In normal recessions, low interest rates encourage banks to lend and the economy to recover. But Japanese banks were not going to lend more. They were quietly absorbing losses on existing loans while pretending those losses did not exist. This created what economists later named the balance sheet recession. The problem was not the price of money, interest rates were already near zero by 1995, but the willingness to borrow. Companies with excess debt do not respond to lower rates by borrowing more. They use every spare yen to reduce their debt load. The Bank of Japan faced what Keynes had called the liquidity trap 70 years earlier. Interest rates could go no lower, yet the economy would not respond. This was no longer theoretical. Japan proved it could happen to a modern, sophisticated economy with strong institutions. The political economy made reform impossible. The Ministry of Finance, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, and Japan's major banks were deeply intertwined. Forcing banks to recognize their losses would require recapitalizing them, acknowledging failure, triggering political crisis. So the losses were not recognized. Deflation compounded every problem. When prices fall, consumers postpone purchases, a television will be cheaper next year. When businesses expect falling prices, they do not invest. Japan's GDP deflator fell for 15 consecutive years after 1994. Deflation, once entrenched, feeds itself. Demographics intensified the structural problem. Japan's population was aging faster than any other major economy. An aging population saves more, spends less, and produces fewer workers. This was not a short-term demand problem amenable to stimulus. It was a structural shift in the economy's capacity to grow. The international dimension amplified the trap. Japan's export machine remained powerful, but domestic demand stayed depressed. The economy grew through exports while its domestic private sector remained in perpetual deleveraging. Two Japans existed, the globally competitive manufacturer and the stagnant domestic economy. Japan's policy response was massive, incremental, and largely ineffective for a decade. The government launched 17 fiscal stimulus packages between 1992 and 2001, spending a cumulative 40% of GDP on public works. Japan built highways to nowhere, bridges between uninhabited islands, sea walls along coasts with no storm risk. The infrastructure spending kept unemployment from reaching Depression-era levels but did not restart private sector growth. Each stimulus prevented immediate collapse but did not address the underlying problem, a private sector too indebted to borrow and a banking system too insolvent to lend. The Bank of Japan lowered its policy rate to 0 in 1995, something no major central bank had done since the Depression. When that failed to stimulate borrowing, it introduced quantitative easing in 2001, purchasing government bonds to increase the money supply beyond what interest rate cuts alone could achieve. Quantitative easing, a term virtually unknown before Japan, became the most significant monetary policy innovation of the late 20th century. It would be adopted by the United States, United Kingdom, and European Central Bank after 2008. Japan had invented the instrument and found it insufficient alone. Banking reform came too slowly. The Financial Reconstruction Law of 1998 finally forced major banks to recognize bad loans and accept government recapitalization. Some banks were nationalized. The recognition of losses avoided for 8 years happened in a concentrated period that initially deepened the recession. The lesson about bank resolution became foundational: zombie banks do not recover on their own. The longer losses are hidden, the larger they grow. Forcing recognition is painful in the short term and necessary for long-term recovery. The United States would apply this lesson, imperfectly but more swiftly, in 2009. Japan also demonstrated the limits of monetary policy when balance sheets are impaired. The central bank can make money cheap, it cannot make reluctant debtors borrow or reluctant banks lend. Fiscal policy and structural reform must carry the weight when monetary transmission is broken. Japan's GDP in 2003 was roughly the same as Japan's GDP in 1992. An entire decade of economic output had been lost. The Japanese term, Yushinoreta Junen, the lost decade, eventually had to be extended to a lost 2 decades, then 3, as the fundamental dynamics persisted. The Nikkei 225 did not return to its 1989 peak until 2024, 35 years later. Japanese real estate values in major cities recovered partially but never returned to bubble levels. An entire generation learned that assets can fall and stay fallen for longer than any investment horizon. The human cost was diffuse rather than dramatic. Japan avoided mass unemployment through lifetime employment systems and government spending. But living standards stagnated, wage growth stopped, and a generation of young workers entered a labor market of contingent employment and reduced expectations. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio rose from 60% in 1990 to over 250% by 2020, the highest of any advanced economy, as the government borrowed continuously to sustain demand. The debt has not triggered a crisis because Japan borrows in its own currency from its own citizens. But it represents an unresolved burden. The positive legacy was methodological. Japan's lost decade became the most studied natural experiment in modern macroeconomics. Concepts like the liquidity trap, balance sheet recession, and the zero lower bound moved from theoretical curiosities to central policy concerns that every major central bank would eventually face. Ben Bernanke, who would lead the Federal Reserve in 2008, had written extensively about Japan's mistakes. When the American crisis arrived, he applied the Japanese lesson: move fast, recognize losses, recapitalize banks, use unconventional tools without hesitation. Japan's failure became America's playbook. What the world learned: when a debt-fueled asset bubble collapses, the damage is measured in decades. Delaying bank loss recognition extends the pain without reducing it. And deflation, once entrenched, is almost impossible to escape through monetary policy alone. Japan had proven it. Others were not paying attention. Japan's debt deflation trap replicated the dynamic Keynes had analyzed in the Great Depression, Episode 5, with one crucial difference: Japan had the theoretical tools to diagnose the problem and still failed to apply the remedy in time. Understanding a trap and escaping it are different skills entirely. The patterns repeat. The faces change. The cost is always borne by those who had no say. Economic Crisis Explained. 2026.